The evening sun cast long shadows across the city streets as a tall, powerfully built man made his way through the bustling downtown area. His walk was different from the hurried pace of the office workers heading home, each step measured and purposeful, like someone who had learned that rushing only made you miss important details. The sleeves of his plain black t-shirt couldn't hide the stories written on his skin in ink, intricate tattoos that weren't just random designs picked from a parlor wall. These markings told a deeper story. On his right arm, coordinates marked the places where he'd lost brothers in combat. His left forearm bore the emblem of Force Recon, earned through months of training so brutal that only a handful of Marines made it through. Each tattoo was a chapter in a 15-year career that had taken him to the world's most dangerous places and brought him back changed, but unbroken. At 42, his face carried the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and chosen to be better because of it. The faint scar above his right eyebrow had a story behind it. A night operation in Afghanistan when his unit had been ambushed, and he'd led all 16 of his men to safety despite taking shrapnel to the face. But you wouldn't know any of this by looking at him. He carried himself without the swagger that younger veterans sometimes showed, his strength evident but understated. The neighborhood around him was changing as the sun dipped lower. Store owners were pulling down their shutters, and the comfortable crowd of daytime shoppers was giving way to a different element. He noticed everything. The group of teenagers trying too hard to look tough on the corner, the elderly woman clutching her purse tighter as she hurried past them, the flickering streetlight that created perfect shadows for someone to hide in. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness had been drilled into him until it was as natural as breathing. He was headed to the Veterans Crisis Center, a plain brick building that had become his second home over the past few years. After leaving the service, he'd struggled like many others. The nightmares, the anger, the feeling that civilian life was somehow less real than what he'd experienced overseas, he'd faced them all. But instead of letting those challenges destroy him, he'd found purpose in helping others fight the same battles. The center wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside, it was a lifeline for veterans battling their inner demons. 3 nights a week, he volunteered there, talking guys through their darkest moments, teaching coping skills he'd learned the hard way. And sometimes just sitting in silence with someone who couldn't put their pain into words yet. It wasn't the kind of heroics that won medals, but to him, it was just as important as any mission he'd run in combat. The tattoo on his chest, hidden under his shirt, was his newest one. The date he'd finally admitted he needed help himself, written in simple black numbers. That had been the real test of courage, harder than any military challenge. Now, 4 years later, he was the one others turned to for strength, though he made sure they understood that strength sometimes meant asking for help. As he walked, he rolled his shoulders, loosening muscles that still carried the memory of wearing body armor in 120-degree heat. The weight of his past was always there, but it no longer dragged at him like it once had. He'd learned to carry it with grace, to use it as a tool for helping others rather than a burden that pulled him down. The street was quieter now, the kind of quiet that sometimes made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in combat zones. But this wasn't a war zone, he reminded himself. This was home, and he was here to help, not to fight. Still, old instincts died hard, and he found himself scanning doorways and alleys automatically, his trained eyes picking up details others might miss. He was 3 blocks from the center when he first noticed the shadows moving wrong in a nearby alley. Years of experience told him someone was trying to stay hidden and doing a poor job of it. He didn't break stride or give any sign that he'd spotted them, but his mind was already running through scenarios, analyzing angles and escape routes with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times when it really mattered. The fading daylight glinted off his dark skin, highlighting the firm set of his jaw and the calm in his eyes. Those eyes had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but they remained alert and observant, missing nothing. He knew what some people saw when they looked at him. A big black man with tattoos, someone to be feared or challenged. They didn't see the decorated veteran, the counselor, the man who'd chosen to protect others even after hanging up his uniform. The first sign of trouble came with the sound of footsteps trying too hard to be quiet. 3 young men emerged from the alley ahead, spreading out across the sidewalk in what they probably thought was an intimidating formation. The veteran noticed their ages first, None of them could be older than 22, barely more than kids really. Their movements reminded him of young recruits in basic training, all swagger and no substance, trying to look tougher than they felt. The leader was tall and lean, wearing a red bandana that looked brand new, probably bought just to look the part. He had the kind of confidence that came from having backup, not from real strength. The way he positioned himself showed he was used to intimidating ordinary people, but his stance was all wrong. Weight too far forward, balance compromised. Any decent fighter would have spotted the weaknesses immediately. His two friends moved to flank the veteran, one on each side, trying to cut off escape routes. The one on the left wore an oversized hoodie despite the warm evening, probably hiding his nervousness as much as any weapon. The third guy, stockier than the others, kept glancing around like he was afraid someone might see them. Their formation might have worked on a regular person walking home from work, but to someone trained in combat tactics, it was amateur hour. The veteran didn't break stride or show any reaction. His mind catalogued every detail automatically. The way the leader's hands kept twitching toward his pockets, how the guy in the hoodie was breathing too fast, the slight tremor in the stocky one's movements. He'd seen real threats before, men who'd trained their whole lives to kill. These three were playing at being dangerous and doing a poor job of it. "Hey, big man," the leader called out, his voice carrying a false bravado that echoed off the brick walls. "Looks like you took a wrong turn." His friends snickered on cue, but there was tension in their laughter. The veteran could read uncertainty in their body language. They were used to their targets showing fear by now, but they weren't getting the reaction they expected. The street had emptied quickly, the few remaining pedestrians hurrying away at the first sign of trouble. A car drove past slowly, its driver deliberately not looking their way. The veteran noticed a woman in a nearby shop doorway pull out her phone, probably calling the police. He made a mental note to wrap this up quickly, one way or another. The three young men continued their approach, trying to match each other's swagger like they'd practiced it. The leader pulled out a switchblade, the kind you could buy cheap at any pawn shop. He flicked it open with what he probably thought was a menacing flourish, but the veteran noticed the slight shake in his hand. The blade caught the light from a nearby street lamp, and for a moment, the scene felt surreal. These boys playing at being men, waving their store-bought weapons at someone who'd faced down real warriors. "That's a nice watch you got there," the leader said, gesturing with his knife. "Why don't you hand it over, along with your wallet? Make this easy on yourself." His friends moved closer, producing their own knives. They were trying to look synchronized, but their timing was off. The veteran could have disarmed all three of them in seconds. The moves were so deeply ingrained, they were practically muscle memory. But as he stood there, seemingly surrounded, the veteran saw something familiar in their eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in young recruits on their first patrol, fear masked by aggression, uncertainty hidden behind threats. These weren't hardened criminals, they were lost kids trying to prove something to themselves and each other. The stocky one's knife hand was trembling now, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. The one in the hoodie had started sweating despite the cooling evening air. Even their leader's confidence was cracking around the edges as his target continued to show no fear. They were used to people either running away or falling apart by now. The calm stillness they were facing instead was throwing them off balance. The veteran remained relaxed but alert, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady. To anyone watching, he might have looked unprepared, maybe even oblivious to the danger. But his mind was working through scenarios with the speed and precision that came from years of combat experience. He noted the distances between them, the angle of approach, the way their grips betrayed their inexperience with weapons. A police siren wailed in the distance, and the stocky one flinched. The veteran saw the moment of doubt cross his face, saw him glance at his friends, as if wondering if this was really worth it. But they were in too deep now, their pride pushing them forward even as their instincts told them to back away. The leader took another step closer, his blade extended, trying to reclaim control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. The evening had grown quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the scuff of shoes on concrete. The veteran could feel the tension building, knew these next few moments would determine how everything played out. He'd been in situations like this before, though usually with much higher stakes and better trained opponents. The familiar calm of combat readiness settled over him, but this time it was tempered by something else, A recognition that what these young men needed wasn't a lesson in violence, but something very different. The street had grown unnaturally quiet, like the moment before a storm breaks. The veteran watched as the leader's confidence started cracking at the edges, frustration replacing his earlier swagger. No one had ever just stood there before, calm and unafraid. It was throwing off their whole routine. "I said, 'Give me your wallet,'" the leader repeated, his voice rising slightly. He jabbed his knife forward for emphasis, but the movement was clumsy, telegraphing his intentions like a rookie in basic training. The veteran didn't even blink. His mind flashed back to his first hand-to-hand combat instructor, who'd always said that real fights were won or lost in the mind before the first punch was thrown. The guy in the hoodie shifted nervously, his sneakers scraping against the concrete. "Come on, man," he added, trying to sound tough, but his voice cracking slightly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." His knife hand was shaking so badly now that he could barely keep the blade pointed forward. The veteran's training screamed at him to act. He could see 15 different ways to end this confrontation in seconds. The leader's stance was wrong, his weight distributed poorly. One quick move would send him sprawling. The guy in the hoodie was so tense that a loud noise might make him jump out of his skin. The stocky one was already looking for an excuse to run. But as he stood there, another memory surfaced. A young soldier he counseled at the center last month. That kid had been just like these three once, thinking violence was the only way to prove himself. Now he was turning his life around, helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. Sometimes the toughest person in a fight was the one who chose not to throw a punch. The leader lunged forward suddenly, probably hoping to startle a reaction. His knife sliced through empty air as the veteran smoothly shifted his weight, moving just enough to avoid the blade while staying well within striking distance. It was the kind of movement that came from years of training, fluid and effortless, like water flowing around a rock. "That's your first mistake," the veteran said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop and listen. "You're telegraphing your moves. In a real fight, that would get you killed." The leader froze, confusion replacing anger on his face. This wasn't how these confrontations were supposed to go. The stocky one's eyes widened as he noticed something. The way the veteran had moved, the casual confidence that spoke of serious training. "Hey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at his arm." The sleeve of the veteran's t-shirt had risen slightly during his movement, revealing part of a distinctive tattoo that any military family would recognize. The air changed then, tension giving way to uncertainty. The leader tried to maintain his aggressive stance, but doubt had crept into his eyes. He'd heard stories about guys like this, men who'd spent years in combat zones, who could end fights before they began. His knife suddenly felt very small and inadequate in his hand. "Second mistake," the veteran continued, his tone almost conversational. "You're bunched up too close together. One person with training could take all three of you out before you could blink." He wasn't bragging, just stating facts, the way he might point out flaws in a training exercise. "But that's not why we're here, is it?" The guy in the hoodie swallowed hard. Something in the veteran's voice reminded him of his uncle, a former army surgeon who'd tried to steer him straight years ago. He'd ignored that advice then, but now, facing someone who radiated the same quiet strength, he wasn't so sure about his choices. "Third mistake," the veteran said, shifting his weight slightly. The movement was subtle, but somehow it put him in a position to control the entire situation. "You're fighting when you don't have to. Fighting should always be the last resort, not the first choice." His words carried the weight of someone who'd learned this lesson the hard way. The leader's arm had started to tire from holding the knife out. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. Nothing in their previous encounters had prepared him for this. People were supposed to be scared, supposed to hand over their valuables with shaking hands. They weren't supposed to stand there calmly pointing out mistakes in technique. The veteran saw the moment the leader's resolve began to crack. It was subtle. A slight lowering of the knife. A shift in stance from aggressive to uncertain. He recognized it from countless confrontations in war zones, that moment when someone realized they were in way over their head. But unlike those situations, this one didn't have to end in violence. "I could show you 3 different ways to disarm you right now," the veteran continued, his voice steady and calm. "But I'd rather show you something more important. He slowly raised his hands, not in surrender, but in the way a teacher might gesture while making a point. "I'd rather show you what real strength looks like." The distant police siren had grown closer, but no one moved. The three young men stood frozen, caught between their practiced routine of intimidation and the growing realization that they had stumbled into something they didn't understand. Their target wasn't acting like a victim because he wasn't one. He was something else entirely, something their street experience hadn't prepared them for. The veteran took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking. When his voice came, it carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard. "You boys think you know something about strength," he said, looking each of them in the eye. "But real strength, that's something entirely different." The streetlight caught the details of his tattoo as he shifted his weight, the iconic globe and anchor of Force Recon, surrounded by intricate details that told stories of battles fought far from home. The stocky one's eyes widened in recognition. His older brother had served in the Marines, had spoken about Force Recon operators with a mix of awe and respect that he'd never quite understood until now. "My brother," the stocky one started, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was a Marine. He used to talk about Force Recon guys. Said they were—" He trailed off, the knife in his hand suddenly feeling like a child's toy. His brother would be ashamed to see him now, trying to rob someone who'd served alongside the men he respected so much. The veteran nodded slowly. "We're a brotherhood," he said. "And that brotherhood taught me something important. The toughest battles aren't won with fists or knives." He gestured at their weapons, still held awkwardly in uncertain hands. "Those are just tools of weak men trying to look strong." The leader's swagger had completely evaporated now, replaced by a mix of confusion and growing respect. He'd grown up on these streets, learned to project toughness as a survival skill, but something about this man's presence made all of that feel hollow. This was real strength, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. "Let me tell you about real strength," the veteran continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd seen things that had changed him forever. "Real strength is watching your best friend take a bullet and still completing the mission because others are counting on you. Real strength is coming home from war and choosing to help others instead of letting the darkness consume you." The guy in the hoodie lowered his knife first, slipping it back into his pocket with trembling hands. He'd never felt more like a fraud in his life. Here they were, three young guys playing at being tough, confronting someone who'd faced real danger and come out the other side not bitter, but determined to make a difference. The veteran moved then, but not to attack. Instead, he reached up and pulled aside the collar of his t-shirt, revealing another tattoo. This one a string of numbers. "Know what this is?" he asked. "The date I admitted I needed help. That took more courage than any firefight I've been in." His honesty struck them like a physical blow, challenging everything they thought they knew about strength and weakness. The leader's knife clattered to the sidewalk, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet street. "We didn't," he started, then stopped, unsure what to say. "How do you apologize for trying to rob someone who'd sacrificed so much for others?" "You didn't know," the veteran finished for him. "But now you do. And knowing means you've got a choice to make." He bent down and picked up the fallen knife, handling it with the casual expertise of someone who'd trained with far deadlier weapons. With smooth, practiced movements, he dismantled it, pointing out the poor construction that made it more dangerous to the user than any target. "See this spring? It's weak, likely to fail when you least expect it. Kind of like using fear to control others, it might work for a while, but it'll fail you when it matters most." He handed the pieces back to the leader, who took them automatically, still struggling to process how completely the situation had changed. The stocky one had tears in his eyes now, thinking about his brother, about the path he'd chosen that would disappoint his family so much. He started, his voice cracking. "I want to be better than this." The street had grown darker, but somehow it felt less threatening now. The veteran looked at these three young men and saw not enemies or thugs, but lost souls searching for something they didn't quite understand. He saw himself at their age, before the Marines had given him direction, before he'd learned what real strength meant. "The hardest thing about strength," he said, his voice gentler now, "is that it often looks different than we expect. Sometimes it looks like asking for help. Sometimes it looks like admitting you're on the wrong path." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And sometimes it looks like choosing to change, even when change is the scariest thing you can imagine. The guy in the hoodie wiped his face with his sleeve, no longer trying to hide his emotions. How? He cleared his throat and tried again. How did you do it? How did you become? He gestured vaguely at the veteran, unable to find the right words. One day at a time, the veteran replied, with help from others who'd walked the same path, with the understanding that every day is a chance to be better than you were yesterday. He looked at each of them in turn, seeing not who they were now, but who they could become. And that chance, it's available to anyone brave enough to take it. The night air had grown cooler, but none of the 4 men standing on that street corner felt the chill. The veteran watched as something shifted in their eyes, that moment when understanding begins to replace fear and anger. He'd seen it before in young recruits, in troubled veterans, in men and women looking to change their lives. It was the look of someone seeing a different path for the first time. "You know what I see when I look at you 3?" the veteran asked, his voice carrying the weight of experience rather than judgment. "I see myself at your age, lost, angry, looking for respect in all the wrong places." He gestured to the street around them. "I walked these same streets once, thinking toughness meant making others fear me." The leader's hands were empty now, his knife forgotten on the ground. His shoulders had lost their artificial square set, showing his real age, barely old enough to drink, trying to play a role he'd learned from watching too many movies. "What changed?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you?" He gestured vaguely at the veteran, struggling to put into words the transformation he could sense but not quite understand. "I got lucky," the veteran replied, a hint of sadness touching his voice. "Had a recruiter who saw past my attitude, saw something worth saving. But it wasn't just the Marines that changed me. It was learning what real strength looks like." He turned to the stocky one, whose eyes were still fixed on the Force Recon tattoo. "Your brother probably told you stories about what we do, right?" The stocky one nodded quickly. He said, Force Recon guys were the toughest of the tough. That you could kill a man 20 different ways." His voice held a mix of awe and shame now, remembering his brother's stories while holding a cheap switchblade. The veteran shook his head slowly. "That's what everyone focuses on. The fighting, the combat skills. But you know what makes Force Recon really special?" He paused, making sure he had their full attention. "It's not about being the toughest. It's about being the smartest. About knowing when not to fight. About protecting others, not intimidating them." The guy in the hoodie shifted his weight, pulling back his hood for the first time. His face was young, barely out of his teens, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. "But out here," he gestured at the street, "respect comes from being tough, from making others fear you." "That's not respect," the veteran said firmly. "That's terror. And terror always turns to hatred eventually." He looked each of them in the eye. "Real respect? That comes from being someone others can count on. Someone who lifts others up instead of pushing them down." A police siren wailed in the distance, closer now, but nobody moved. The moment felt too important to break. The veterans saw the battle playing out in their eyes, the struggle between the path they'd chosen and the possibility of something different. "You think what you're doing here makes you tough?" He gestured at their dropped weapons. "I've seen tough. Tough is one of my buddies, missing both legs, learning to walk again because he refused to give up. Tough is a veteran fighting addiction demons every day, but still showing up to help others. Tough is admitting you're on the wrong path and having the courage to change." The leader swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "But how?" His voice cracked on the word. "How do you just change when this is all you know?" "You start by making a choice," the veteran said. "Right here, right now, you choose to be better than your circumstances, better than what others expect from you." He reached into his pocket, making all 3 young men tense automatically, but pulled out only a business card. It was worn at the edges, like he carried it everywhere. "And you accept help when it's offered." The guy in the hoodie had moved closer, drawn by something in the veteran's words. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the card. "Direction," the veteran replied simply. "A chance to learn what real strength is, to be part of something bigger than yourself." He looked at the stocky one. "To make your brother proud instead of ashamed." The young man flinched at that, but didn't look away. At the veteran's center, the veteran continued, "We don't just help vets. We run programs for young people looking to turn their lives around. Teaching discipline, purpose, real self-defense, not this street-fighting nonsense. He held up the card. 3 nights a week I'm there, working with guys not so different from you. The leader looked at his friends, then back at the veteran. In his eyes was a war between pride and hope, between the familiar path of violence and the unknown territory of change. The veteran recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own eyes years ago, in the bathroom mirror of a recruiting office. The veteran held out the business card, its edges soft from being carried in his wallet. The streetlight caught the simple text, an address, phone number, and the words Veterans Support Center, Building Better Futures. Such a small thing to represent such a huge choice. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had commanded elite units. We start with breakfast. Nothing fancy, just coffee and donuts, but it's not really about the food. He smiled slightly, remembering his own first morning there. It's about showing up. About taking that first step. The leader stared at the card like it might bite him. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, not from fear now, but from the weight of the moment. What happens there? He asked, trying to sound casual but unable to hide his interest. First day, we talk, that's all. The veteran's voice softened with understanding. No pressure, no judgments. You'll meet some other guys who've walked the same path you're on now. Some veterans, some local kids who chose a different way. He looked at each of them in turn. You'll hear their stories. And if you want, you can share yours. The guy who'd pulled back his hoodie stepped forward, his young face showing a mix of hope and doubt. But we just tried to. He gestured helplessly at the scene around them, the abandoned weapons on the ground. Why would you help us? The veteran's answer came without hesitation. Because someone helped me. Because every person deserves a chance to be better than their worst moments. He paused, letting that sink in. And because I've seen too many young men like you end up in prison or worse, when all they really needed was someone to show them a different path. The stocky one had been quiet, lost in thought. Now he spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. My brother, he'd be real disappointed in me right now. He looked up at the veteran, eyes shining with unched tears. But maybe he'd be proud if I changed. Pride has to start with you, the veteran replied gently. Your brother's opinion matters, sure. But what matters more is being able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning and be proud of who you're becoming. He'd said these words before to others, but they never lost their power because they came from his own experience. The leader was turning the card over and over in his hands, reading and rereading the simple text. You teach self-defense there? He asked, trying to find familiar ground in this unfamiliar territory. Among other things, the veteran nodded. But real self-defense, not street fighting. We teach discipline, control, respect. How to avoid fights instead of starting them. He gestured at their discarded weapons. How to be strong without needing those. A police car cruised by slowly, its lights off but its presence felt by all. The 3 young men tensed, but the veteran remained calm. The car moved on, and he used the moment to make a point. That could have gone very differently tonight. You could be in the back of that car right now, or worse. Instead, you're getting an opportunity. Question is, what will you do with it? The guy who'd worn the hoodie picked up his knife from where he dropped it, but instead of holding it like a weapon, he looked at it with something like disgust. Could we? He hesitated, then continued stronger. Could we maybe turn these in? At the center? I don't want this anymore. The veteran's face showed approval, but he kept his voice neutral. There's a box for that. No questions asked. Lots of guys have put their past in that box. It's usually the first step. He watched as the young man's shoulders straightened just a little with the weight of that decision. The leader looked at his friends, then back at the veteran. 9 a.m. He asked, his voice carrying a mix of hope and challenge. You'll really be there? Every morning, the veteran confirmed. Rain or shine. Been doing it for 4 years now. He smiled slightly. Started out sitting on the other side of the table, actually. Needed help myself. Now I help others. That's how it works. You get help, you grow stronger, you help others grow stronger. The stocky one wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm gonna call my brother tonight, he said quietly. Tell him I'm trying to change. His voice grew stronger with each word, as if saying it out loud made it more real. The street had grown quiet, the distant sounds of the city a soft backdrop to this moment of transformation. The veteran saw in their faces what he'd seen in his own years ago, that first glimpse of a different future, scary but full of possibility. The next morning dawned clear and cool. The veteran arrived at the center early, as he always did, but today he felt a different kind of anticipation. He'd seen something in those young men's eyes last night, a spark of hope, a desire for change. Whether they'd act on it was another matter entirely. He unlocked the front door, breathing in the familiar smell of coffee already brewing. The old building wasn't much to look at, one brick outside, simple furnishings within, but to many it had become a sanctuary, a place where change wasn't just possible but expected. 8:30 came and went. He busied himself with the morning routine, setting out coffee cups, arranging chairs in the meeting room, putting fresh donuts on the scratched but clean plastic plates. Every time a car passed outside, he found himself glancing at the door. At 8:55, movement caught his eye through the front window. The stocky one from last night stood on the sidewalk, shifting his weight from foot to foot, wearing clean clothes and a nervous expression. His brother stood next to him in a Marine Corps t-shirt, one hand on his shoulder, pride and concern mixing on his face. The veteran watched through the window as they talked, saw the older brother pull the younger into a tight hug before giving him a gentle push toward the door. The young man took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked inside. His eyes found the veteran immediately. "I called Ken last night," he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. "Told Ken everything. He cried. Then he said he'd bring me here himself. He swallowed hard. Said it was the first time he'd been proud of me in years." Before the veteran could respond, the door opened again. The guy who'd worn the hoodie entered, looking younger in the morning light, wearing a plain white t-shirt instead of the oversized hoodie. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear, like someone who hadn't slept much but had done a lot of thinking. "My mom," he said quietly, looking at the floor. "She saw me throwing that knife in the trash last night, started crying, asking what was going on. I told her I was going to try to be different." He looked up finally, meeting the veteran's eyes. "She hugged me for like 10 minutes straight." 9 o'clock came and went. The veteran didn't mention the leader's absence, just got the two young men settled with coffee and donuts. Other regulars began filtering in. A gray-haired Vietnam vet who'd been coming since the center opened, a young woman who'd turned her life around and now helped others do the same, a few local kids who'd found purpose in the center's programs. At 9:15, the door opened one more time. The leader stood there, looking smaller somehow without his tough guy act. His eyes darted around the room, landing on his friends, then the veteran. "Sorry I'm late," he mumbled. "Took me 3 tries to walk through that door." The veteran just nodded, poured another cup of coffee, pulled up another chair. The morning meeting began like it always did, with introductions and quiet conversation. The 3 young men sat together, shoulders touching, drawing strength from each other's presence. Over the next few months, the veteran watched their transformation with quiet satisfaction. The stocky one threw himself into the physical training, his brother often joining in, their relationship healing through shared effort and understanding. The guy who'd worn the hoodie discovered a talent for mentoring younger kids, his gentle nature emerging once he stopped trying to hide it. The leader took longest to open up, but when he finally shared his story, about growing up without a father, about thinking toughness was the only way to earn respect, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. 2 months later, he helped break up a fight outside the center, talking down the angry young men with words the veteran recognized as his own. They weren't the only ones who changed. Other young people from the neighborhood, seeing the transformation in guys they'd known, started showing up at the center. The 3 friends became living proof that change was possible, that it was never too late to choose a different path. One evening, almost 6 months after that first night, the veteran stayed late doing paperwork. He heard familiar voices outside, his 3 former attackers, now regular volunteers, talking and laughing as they left for the day. Through the window, he watched them walk away, heads high, shoulders straight, no weapons in sight. On his desk sat the knife box, fuller now, each weapon representing someone's choice to change. Next to it was a framed photo from last week's community service project, the three young men standing proud in their volunteer t-shirts, surrounded by kids who now looked up to them as role models. The veteran smiled, remembering his own transformation years ago. Sometimes the toughest battles weren't fought with fists or weapons, but with hope and patience and the courage to change. Sometimes the biggest victories came not from defeating an enemy, but from turning potential enemies into allies, into friends, into better versions of themselves. He turned off the lights and locked up, stepping out into the evening air. The street where he'd first met those young men looked different now, not because it had changed, but because they had. Their story had become part of the center's legend, proof that one moment of choice, one offer of help, one decision to change could transform not just a life, but an entire community.